I'm Drew Stevenson, and this is a lecture for my administrative law class. This is part 2 of our little video series, a 3-part series on the social safety net. I'm trying to give you what you really need to know about poverty law and programs for the poor for your administrative law class. Now, I didn't say this in the last video. I want to make sure you understand it here. So a lot of our administrative law is actually about regulating industries. And sometimes these are actually pretty wealthy industries like the banking industry or financial sector, or the healthcare industry, or the oil and gas industry. So one kind of dimension or end of the spectrum of administrative law is regulating the people in our society that have the assets and the big companies and the essential industries, the wealthy or consolidated industries. There's a whole other area of administrative law, though, that's about the social safety net and public benefits programs and assistance for needy individuals and so forth. And then, of course, we have a kind of a third dimension that's general public safety. So you might think about the FDA or the CDC and approval for and manufacture of vaccines or pharmaceuticals and so forth. So let's go to our slides. In this video, we're going to be talking about some background policy issues that might be helpful to think about or have on your radar as you are reading some of the cases in your administrative law casebook, like Goldberg v. Kelly, which talks about the problem of the social malaise, or The Dissent in Goldberg v. Kelly by Hugo Black, that talks about the looming popular backlash against the welfare state, the burgeoning welfare rolls. You could think about Mathews v. Eldridge and the Social Security Disability Program, and the Supreme Court's attitude that these people, recipients who are disabled, are not necessarily needy. And you could think about it with a case like Richardson v. Perales, which affects procedures and hearing rights by the agency. So here we're going to talk about some policy issues. And I want you to think about, why does the government need to take care of its poor? This is a video from overseas, and you can see shantytowns, or people living in tents in a large landfill outside of an urban center. This type of scene, it can be easily found all over the world. There are millions of people in the world, especially in developing countries, that basically live in lean-tos and tents and shantytowns in humongous landfills. And so one of the questions is, do we want this, or do we want to have a society where no one is living in the landfill? And then we have a question of, what's our end game here? Are we basically just trying to prevent starvation and homelessness? Is that the goal? Because that's going to be a different type of program than, say, if we're trying to minimize inequality. Like, is our concern that the rich are getting richer and the poor are getting poorer in our society, and we have a vanishing middle class, or we want to have a society that's more egalitarian and people have more in common with each other? Because that's going to be a different program than if all we care about is making sure that no one's living in a landfill. Are we trying to preserve personhood and personal dignity for people, regardless of their income or earning potential or things like that? Or there's also people who take a very kind of cynical or strictly hardcore capitalistic approach to public assistance programs and say that this is really about maximizing productivity. If you think about it, if you have a huge percentage of your population unemployed and living in abject poverty or homelessness, those people are not in the workforce, right? They're not contributing to your GDP or to share values in the stock market. So some would say we should have a social safety net so that we can maximize productivity, and the country overall will be wealthier. Well, a similar sort of cynical or self-centered argument would be that we want to raise our home values and property values. And so if I can go back for just a moment to this slide, if you think about, if you have large numbers, thousands and thousands of homeless people in the vicinity where you live, or a refugee camp, or squatters or a shanty town, or something like that, then that affects property values and home values, and as opposed to a community that doesn't have those things. And so maybe we want to have a social safety net so that it encourages property development and land development, and so on. Another thing that people think about is the problem of social unrest or uprisings or revolution. And the idea is, if your oppressed underclass in your society gets too large and too desperate, at some point they are going to start breaking things, right? And this is kind of an essential tenet, partly of a Marxist worldview, that at some point, when as the lower class gets really big and the upper class gets really small, the lower class are going to say, we've had enough. And so one idea or rationalization or policy argument for having a social safety net, having these government programs, is to preserve the security and stability of our democracy. And a milder version of this would be that if you reduce poverty, you reduce the crime rates in your community and other externalities of poverty. So if you have concentrated poverty in an area, it's very common that substance abuse and addiction is very common, and that sets off a cascade of other effects, deleterious effects. You have drug trafficking, which then means you have weapons trafficking, and maybe human trafficking that go along with these things. Think about disease. So if you have a refugee camp where people are kind of squatters, these are notorious for having cholera outbreaks and other things like that, because there's improper hygiene and people are living on top of each other, kind of. And so if somebody gets sick, everybody gets sick. In an inner city community that's poor, if people are too poor to get healthcare for their kids, then the children are not getting their childhood vaccines, and we have higher rates of childhood diseases. Illiteracy. So maybe you grew up thinking about illiteracy as, it would be so sad not to be able to read your favorite novelist or something like that. But imagine not being able to read any of the street signs, not be able to read warning signs that the government has put up, or to know which building is the courthouse because you can't read the labels on the buildings or the signage out front. And so illiteracy, again, sets off a cascade of other problems. And if we address poverty, if we have programs to reduce poverty, again, it starts to eliminate these things that affect all of us. Once again, this is a type of argument that is not focused on the individual's dignity or humanity, which I think for me is more motivating, but instead it's the idea that, and this is expressed in Goldberg v. Kelly, that if we take care of the poor, it's good for all of us. We're all better off if we have a social safety net for the least fortunate members of our society. This is an interesting poster. This cartoon is actually not a comic. This is from a Social Security Administration public service announcement poster from the mid-20th century. And it highlights a point about what happens if you don't have government programs. In many societies, the poor, the elderly, the disabled would be taken in and provided for by family and relatives. And if they don't have family or relatives, or get rejected or shunned by their family, then religious groups intervene, right? And so this could be a sectarian group, or the church, or a convent or monastery. They would run homeless shelters and refugee centers and soup kitchens and so forth. You have religious clerics who would go around giving out private alms. We mean like pocket change to beggars on the street and so forth. And so, but this highlights something just with the age issue. So here's the quote: "I'm 100 years old today, and mine has been a full life, and most of it has been lived in other people's homes." And I want you to stop for a moment. A lot of people haven't really thought this through and done the math. So let's say that you lived with your parents growing up for 20 years of your life. I know you're thinking, I became an adult when I was 18, but let's be honest, a lot of people, the first year or two after high school, their parents' home is still home base, right? It's where you go on breaks from school and things like that. So or maybe you took a year off after college. So let's put it together and call it 20 years living with your parents. Then you're out on your own. You're supporting yourself. You're in the workforce. You have your own place. You retire at 65, and sometime in your late 60s, let's say you are widowed, and you are left alone, and now you're 70. Now, in our modern society, you might have a nice pension and you have Social Security retirement, or old age benefits, and a number of other resources to encourage the elderly to live somewhat independently. But for most of human history, around the time you were 70, you moved back in with your grown children and became dependent on them. And so now I want you to think 70 to 100 is 30 years. So at some point around your 100th birthday, you might actually be realizing that you have now spent 51 years, or more than half of your life, dependent on other people instead of living on your own and taking care of yourself, or maybe taking care of others. And a lot of people would like to live forever and live to a ripe old age, but think about the math that at some point you are going to cross a line. Just like if you're married and you're married for a long time, at some point you realize that you've been married for more time than you were single, right? You've been married for most of your life. Well, if you live long enough, you will reach a time in your life where you have lived most of your life in other people's homes, dependent on them, either as a child or as the elderly grandparent, maybe, who is being taken care of. Okay, that concludes our second video. We have a third one that you should watch to try to understand the basic things that you need to know about poverty law and policy with public assistance and public benefits in order to understand what's going on in this section of your administrative law course.